A few weeks ago on Monday Night Raw, the Revival proved that nominative determinism is actually for real. It's legitimately a real thing, as they finally managed to claim the Red Brand's tag team titles for the first time in their careers. After spending the last few years wasting away on the main roster undercard after their stellar stint in NXT, Dash and Dawson were finally elevated to where two wrestlers of their incredible talent should be. Just weeks before this, however, the Revival had one foot in the grave of their WWE careers, having reportedly asked for their release from the company, and it feels like absolutely no coincidence that after collectively requesting a pass out of purgatory, they finally find themselves with gold around their waists. The fear of a frustrated Revival leaving WWE to join AEW and immediately legitimizing their proposed tag team revival seems to have been enough to coax the company into finally booking the top guys the way they actually deserve. And while yes, they absolutely deserve it, it's a shame that this crowning moment had to essentially be forced through. This certainly isn't the first time this has happened in wrestling though, and with the rise of All Elite Wrestling and the subsequent change to the wrestling landscape, we're fairly certain it won't be the last either. Nevertheless, if history has taught us one thing, it's that hastily throwing the gold around the waists of want-away wrestlers doesn't always solve the problem. I'm Adam Nicholas from WhatCulture Wrestling, and this is 8 times wrestlers who wanted to quit were given championships. Number 8, Chris Benoit, the WCW World Heavyweight Championship. With WCW in a complete tailspin at the turn of the millennium, largely thanks to the somewhat disastrous direction of Vince Russo, Executive Vice President Bill Bush had reached the end of his tether and decided it was time for a change. So Bush sent Russo packing, replacing him with a crack booking team. The company's talent, at least what was left of it anyway, didn't exactly meet the news of Russo's departure with universal approval. Legitimately concerned that their spots would now be in peril with the old guard being ushered back in, several wrestlers decided to immediately hand in their notice. Desperate to retain his most promising stars as the company continued to swirl even closer to the toilet, Sullivan started handing out promises faster than Oprah hands out cars. Chris Benoit, who Sullivan saw as one of his most valuable assets, was the hardest sell. The pair already had bad blood following Benoit's affair with Sullivan's wife Nancy years earlier, and the new man in charge knew that drastic measures would have to be taken to assuage the Canadians' reservations. At Sold Out 2000, Sullivan would put the vacant WCW World Heavyweight Championship on the waist of the crippler, supposedly as a way to reward his years of hard work, and absolutely definitely not as a bargaining chip. Absolutely not. 100% not. Definitely, absolutely not. Regardless, it didn't work. The newly crowned Benoit walked away from the company the very next day, taking his fellow radicals with him too, just for good measure. Number 7, Ric Flair, the WWF World Championship. Today, reflecting through rose-tinted glasses on the Q&A circuit, and actually probably through a glass of rosé sometimes too, truth be told, Ric Flair regards his brief but brightly burning WWF run at the start of the 90s as the best time of his career. But had you asked the Nature Boy at the time, well, it's fair to say his outlook might not quite have been so rosy. Although Flair's spell in Stamford glittered with gold, the introduction of the real world's champion to the unreal world of WWE just hadn't quite mixed right. A huge money program with Hulk Hogan at WrestleMania 8 was nipped in the bud after Vince soured on the idea of Flair as a main event draw, and his position within the company became further strained when his second title victory, a television match against an increasingly disinterested Randy Savage, was so below par that the boss ordered it to be retaped. By the time of that match, Flair had already decided he wanted to return to Atlanta. 2 months later, annoyed further by being asked to drop the strap to a young Bret Hart, Slick Rick told his employers to shove it and was released from his Titan turmoil the following February, having done the honours for Mr. Perfect. Number 6, Ricky Steamboat, the WWF Intercontinental title. The spectacular Intercontinental title tussle between Ricky Steamboat and Randy Savage at WrestleMania 3 has become a piece of wrestling folklore, a match that was so good to this day, its mythos continues to stand the test of time. Steamboat's uplifting moment of triumph under the bright lights of the Silverdome is well known throughout the wrestling world, but unfortunately so too is his cruel fall from grace. Mere weeks after raising the belt, both literally and figuratively, it was promptly stripped from the Dragon's waist by WWE management after he asked for time off to be by his wife's side during the birth of his first child. Now, while WWE's decision may have been contextualized as punishment since, you'd have to assume that Bonnie Blood's pregnancy, well, you know, probably wasn't immaculate, was it? As such, Steamboat, obviously anticipating his need to hand in a holiday request, simply kept stum until after he'd had his big WrestleMania moment. He dropped the bombshell shortly afterwards, leaving his employers with little choice but to protect the belt it so recently and so magically managed to elevate. Number 5, Brock Lesnar, the Universal Championship. The tediously constructed smokescreen surrounding Brock Lesnar's will he, won't he walkout saga makes it difficult to say with any certainty whether Brock Lesnar ever actually intended to swap the sports entertainment life for the rigours of legitimate combat. But if we take reports at face value, Brock spent the majority of 2018 angling for a move away from the WWE. Ahead of WrestleMania 34, before, the rumours and speculation surrounding Brock Lesnar's departure back to the Octagon were so intense, fans were basically sat on their hands in New Orleans as they awaited the inevitable coronation of Roman Reigns. But as we all know, the Beast Incarnate did nothing of the sort, defeating the big dog in the Mania main event and continuing his big red title reign. Speculation would carry on right up until the following SummerSlam, as WWE continued to leverage the notion that Lesnar was simply sticking around for the money, hoping they could somehow turn that into a way to finally get fans on board with the company's guy, Roman Reigns. But they did not. The inevitable Reigns win arrived nonetheless, and even though fans weren't blown away by it, the overwhelming relief that this would finally see the end of a lackluster Lesnar run was more than enough to make it all okay. And it did, albeit somewhat briefly. Sadly, real life would tragically intervene to strip Roman Reigns of his hard-fought strap in October, and it's safe to say the WWE Universe wasn't exactly over the moon to find out the perennial want-away Brock Lesnar would be the chosen one to carry the belt once more in his absence. Number 4, TRISH Stratus Women's Championship. Now in fairness, there was absolutely no deception or desperation behind TRISH Stratus' final reign with WWE's original Women's Championship, despite the fact she knew there was no chance at all she'd ever defend it. In 2006, just 6 years into her WWE career, Trish had already achieved everything, or at least everything possible for a woman to achieve in the company at that time. Much like The Rock before her, the Canadian had in truth outgrown the wrestling industry, and having just married her childhood sweetheart, she decided it was time to step away from the business and focus on pastures new. Completely against type, and knowing the value she'd retain in her absence, WWE decided to give Stratus a very rare honorary send-off, setting up a dream retirement match for Lita's WWE Championship at that year's Unforgiven. On this particular occasion, the shovels were left well and truly in the shed, as the Torontan claimed her 7th and last title in front of her home fans. A real, beautiful moment before retiring shortly afterwards. Number 3, CM Punk, the WWE Championship. As his wrestling clock ticked over into its 12th year, CM Punk's battered and bruised body told him it was probably about time to take a break. In his own words, Punk was tired, he was sick, and he was depressed, and so the self-proclaimed best in the world came to the difficult conclusion that he'd call it quits on his WWE tenure in July 2011. With his time dwindling down, Punk was expecting to quietly drift off into the silence, slowly vacating back to the couch at his home in Chicago. And to be honest, he very nearly did just that, until a certain pipe bomb would suddenly and emphatically break the silence. On the 27th of June, at the end of an already exciting Raw Roulette, Punk was handed a live mic, and we all know what happened next. Likewise, we all know where it went too. Punk entered July's Money in the Bank pay-per-view as the company's hottest commodity, but he'd yet to put pen to paper on a contract extension. Much to the elation of his hometown fans, Punk would emerge as the new champion after defeating John Cena, but the mystery behind his future sparked the industry's biggest talking point in years. As we'd soon find out, the ink was still drying on Punk's renewed deal when he pinned John Cena for the belt, as it was revealed that the best in the world had finally signed on the dotted line just as the show went on air. Number 2, Batista, the WWE Championship. It took just half a minute for Batista to knock John Cena off his perch at Elimination Chamber 2010, but in reality, he'd spent over a year fighting to take his place behind the cameras. Now, despite the pair being presented on a level footing on their respective brands, the Animal was left frequently disgruntled when every promotional opportunity outside the ring fell to the company's golden boy and not to him. Adverts and acting roles passed Big Dave by until the Animal eventually stuck his neck out and flat out asked the powers that be if he could be considered for such extracurricular activities. The answer was unfortunately a firm no. So instead, he asked if he'd be allowed to moonlight under his own steam. But again, it was a big fat no for Big Fit Dave. He was WWE property, and that was that. But Batista found it difficult being told what he could and couldn't do, and his frustrations led to him handing in his notice in May 2009. Deciding to maximise the Animal whilst they still had him, the company had Batista win his first WWE title just 1 month later, before claiming a second at the aforementioned squash the following February. He would leave the company under a cloud in mid-2010, before moving into the world of Hollywood, where he slowly but surely forged a fresh and exciting career for himself as an actor. I don't think Dave's regretting that decision anytime soon. We love you, Dave. And number 1, Scott Steiner, WCW Television Champion. During the end of his run with WCW in 1992, after Brother Rick was sidelined following a torn pectoral muscle, Scott Steiner was launched on an experimental singles run that would ultimately culminate with a heel turn. Despite being the superior of the siblings and having the potential to become a solo star, the storyline just didn't sit right with Steiner. Murderizing hapless jobbers was just no fun without his brother in tow, and he adamantly protested new booker Bill Watts' decision to split the pair up. Around the same time, the Michigan alumni were locked in contract negotiations with the financially failing company. Overtures had already been made from both New Japan and WCW's Northeast rivals, and the duo's departure seemed inevitable. However, Steiner's uncooperative attitude didn't prevent Watts from slapping the television title on his new singles hopeful, in an effort to try one last time to turn Steiner's head. And yes, surprise, surprise, it did prove to be as idiotic of a decision as it sounds. When terms couldn't be ironed out, the Steiner brothers, well, they simply quit, packed up their buckets, and headed off to Stamford. Meanwhile, the belt, already struggling to be taken seriously, was rapidly vacated and would be left dormant until the following March.